Welcome to the grand finale of the Cascadia Poetry Festival version 5. I think everybody's had a good time so far, but I just wanted to turn everybody's attention to the back page of the program if you ever have a chance to look at it. And these are some of the people that made it possible. David Fuster, he reached into his own pocket to pay for the sound equipment on the first night. Michael Hefflinger put together the entire youth program. All I had to do was buy the food and everything else was done. So Michael put in probably about 6 months getting that together. Then there's a couple of my friends, Darrell Lund and Laura Fox, who I can always trust to kick in a little bit. And my mom, I always put the arm on her. Is it that time of year again? I go, yeah, it's that time of year again. And then last on that list is Cameron Proudfoot, and he is president and CEO of U.S. Oil Refining Company down in the Tide Flats. And he and his company kicked in significant money. So not all the oil companies are evil. This is a good oil company. That's the thing that keeps my railroad going. And then there's Connie Wally and the Puget Sound Poetry Connection, who first got me involved in poetry festivals. So thanks, Connie. And then we've got the SPLAB board, who I met for the first time ever 2 weeks ago tonight, thanks to Paul. And last but not least, a person who needs no introduction, so I'm not even going to introduce you, Paul Nelson. Turn
this thing off. I didn't know, first of all, I want to acknowledge we're on the ancestral homeland of the Puyallup people. And we are visitors, we are guests. Indian people might say unwelcome, uninvited guests, but we are here nonetheless, and we do it with respect and honor and dignity for the first people of this land. I want to thank Humanities Washington and Artswa also for contributing to help make this festival happen. And what a blessing it is. What a blessing it's been this whole weekend. It's just been fantastic. I'm very grateful to the SPLAB board. SPLAB and key volunteers, can you just kind of hold up your hand? Or if you co-founded SPLAB, could you also hold up your hand? Want to thank Joe and Jared and Matt and Bhakti and Danica and Nadine. I leave anybody out? All the folks who helped make SPLAB go. It was 62 years ago this month that our final poet tonight gave his first poetry reading at Six Gallery in San Francisco, California. It's really remarkable, to create a poetic gesture that changes a culture is really an incredible accomplishment. The fact that eco-poetics was born on that night when this man read For the Death of 100 Whales, that is really an achievement to change the direction of a culture. It's just incredible. And I could probably talk or recite his poetry for a long time, but you came to hear him. But I will read the introduction to his brand new book, Persian Pony, which Richard Olafson put on the Victoria Clipper and said, this is a box of used books, send it to Paul Nelson. And so we have copies that are available. And will you be signing copies of this after the show? He will. So they're available for sale from University Books, and we're grateful for University Books for being here and being the official bookseller of the fest. Out less than a year after his first book, after his last book, Mephistos, Michael McClure gives us the radical vision he's utilized for over 60 years as a poet, playwright, novelist, and essayist. Persian Pony is a summing up of all he stands for since he began writing projective verse in the early 1950s. This latest work from a world-class athlete of openness reflects an oeuvre filled with curiosity, love, and deep experience, an interconnected vision. With the dedication for the protection of all beings, McClure reiterates the title of a journal he co-edited in the early 60s that was part anarchism, part Buddhism, and a strike against censorship. His environmental awareness was taking shape in the 50s when he gave his first reading at Six Gallery in 1955. His poetic courage plumbs the depths of perception, achieves a precision of luminous details, a striking originality, and a range of expression from the cosmic to the microscopic. It's our closing act for this festival. Please welcome Michael McClure.
For a long time, I was probably Richard's closest friend, and he was probably mine. He was visiting me 2 or 3 nights a week. We talked and drank Gallo white port, sitting on the floor. This was when we did not have any furniture. We were still poor. The first sip of white port hits the mid-chest and brings on sudden, intense warmth. The second swallow brings warming to the shoulders. After that, you slip into a sweet, yellow, warm glow and become great storytellers and listeners. Richard had an open face and mobile eyes behind his round glasses. The movements of his mustache emphasized his jokes and stories. As I remember, a pint of white port was 37 cents. We bought it at Benedetti's Liquors on Haight Street, where we bought most of our bottles back in the mid-'60s. And I think Benedetti's became the psychedelic shop. Richard was a disciple to some extent, or more aptly, a pupil of Jack Spicer. He might have met poet Joanne Kiger through Spicer, and also her friend Nemi Frost, and maybe Joe Dunn that way too. Dunn published Richard's first book in his White Rabbit Press series. Richard was an aficionado of Gino and Carlo's bar, Spicer's hangout. When I first met Richard, there was something skittish about his literary background, probably Gino and Carlos and Jack Spicer. I wasn't very fond of them. I liked Richard because of the energetic, skitsy wit and warmth that he carried. I arranged a reading for Richard at CCAC, California College of Arts and Crafts, and I made a poster for it. It was like a boxing poster at the time. I drew it by hand. Richard faced forward with his glasses, hat, and mustache. Across from him, I drew his profile, then wrote Digger under one and Poet under the other. Richard kept that poster up on the wall forever, along with other posters and good notices. He loved it. Everything got very old on his walls. He would hang new things, but he would never take anything away or down. The things about him comforted him and got cobwebby, and it was an old museum of himself. Richard always dressed the same. It was his style, and he wanted to change it as little as possible. I was like that myself at the time. We're all trying to get this exact style of ourselves. Richard's style was shabby, loose threads at the cuff, black pants faded to gray, an old mismatched vest, a navy pea jacket, and later something like love beads around the neck. As he began to be successful, he was even more fearful of change. When the 3-book-in-1 edition of Trout Fishing in America, The Spring Hill Mine Disaster, and Watermelon Sugar was published, it faithfully reproduced the earlier avant-garde editions of his work, including cover photos, critical comments, and pagination. It was a magic formula, and Richard did not want to jiggle it. The planning of each book was a huge strategy, and Richard was a Confederate general. Scheming campaign. He was the same about placing a story of his. He could not simply do it and be done with it. He had to go over everything endlessly. He would phone me a half a dozen times each day to talk to me about a picture, a photograph he thought of using, how to do it, who should do it. He probably phoned novelist Donald Carpenter that many times a day also. He became even more obsessive about contract details with his Delacorte Press publisher and with Grove Press. It was a maddening and painful and dull to sweat over whether to take an advance of $60,000 or $65,000. He would torture out details regarding advertising his book. It was endless and painful for his artist friends who were supporting him emotionally but were near terminal poverty. He wanted to help, he needed it, but he also needed to hurt with his success. It was awful for everyone. In his book, Marble Tea, a prose poem reminiscent of Blake's memorable fancies, in which Richard describes cutting a worm in half on an April morning, part of the worm crawled toward the infinite and part towards the infinitesimal. Richard's success, to my eyes, cut him in half. Part of him was crawling to creation, and another part was crawling towards the destruction of friends through self and booze and the birth of envy. Can you hear me okay? If anybody can't hear me anywhere, tell me. Okay. Oh, I won't need it. Thank you, Paul. As his writing became more divine, Richard became more sexist and more alcoholic. Richard convinced his agent Helen Brand to represent my short plays, Gargoyle Cartoons, and my novel, The Adept. Richard believed in my work the way I believed in his. His poem, For Michael, is beautiful, and his dedication to me and Don Allen and Joanne Kiger in Watermelon Sugar is lovely, especially so since it is his most perfect book. The first thing about Richard and guns that I remember is when he was beginning to get goofy with drinking and success, and he gave Gary Snyder a broken, vintage Japanese machine gun for his son, Kai, so he won't lose his Japanese heritage, he said. As Richard became a kind of monster, his public appearance became sweeter and more like his creative, imaginative, and beautiful person of before. He was a wonderful reader. His voice was smooth as honey and warm and personal, almost sweetly drunken to the ear, and his eyes sparkled with a cross between happiness and the resignation of ineffability of everything. It was real. He felt it. It is all there in the work and in his earlier person. At the reading, he literally loved everyone, and they literally loved him back. They were wowed. When my wife at the time bought a Russian wolfhound puppy, we named him Brodigan. He was skinny and angular, long-faced and long-nosed, and he looked like he had loose threads on his elbows. Richard and I were always showing up in the newspapers, usually the Chronicle. My play, The Beard, was a topic of conversation, and the play's censorship was still going on. I was writing Hell's Angel, Freewheel, Frank's autobiography with him. I was doing a video documentary on the Haight-Ashbury. Richard had stories and reviews appearing everywhere, and columnist Herb Cain loved to mention us. When either of us had our name in the paper, we declared ourselves to be 10-day barons of cafe society. We proclaimed that we were famous for 10 days, and we rushed off to drink at the sidewalk tables of Enrico's Cafe, where we could be admired by mortals. We drank Enrico's stemmed glasses of cold white wine in the afternoon and watched record scouts digging in for the new rock and roll of Frisco, or literary agents, or visiting LA stars coming to ogle the city of love. After a couple of glasses of white wine, Richard began to get owlish and silent with bursts of slightly tipsy talk, and I began to get winishly ennobled in my own ways. I contended that nobody, not even Frank Sinatra, could be famous for more than 10 days in Frisco. Often Richard and I were 10-day barons of cafe society, and sometimes we would get on a roll and manage to keep a barony for a month at a time with overlapping newspaper references. One rule, though, was that you could not accrue baronhoods. A baronhood only lasted 10 days. After that, a second rule was that it could not come from your name being in an advertisement, like an advertisement with the beard. Forget it. That didn't make anybody a cafe baron, 10-day baron. A second rule was that it could not come from your name being in an advertisement. Richard would phone me, or I'd phone him. Hey, I'm a baron. Let's go to Enrico's. One of the things I liked most about Richard was that he was a real poet of the diggers. He was often on Haight Street, passing out papers from the... Am I popping this phone when I speak? This mic? Or is this all right? Good. Okay. Okay. How's that? Pop, pop, pop. Richard was often on Haight Street passing out papers from the Digger Communications Company. I liked that activism. Richard was doing it because he believed in it. I would go down there and do it too, and I was a lot more self-conscious on the street than he was. Richard would pass out papers from the Digger Communication Company urging all seeker youngsters at the Summer of Love to go immediately to the VD clinic at the first sign. Richard has a poem about Clapp and the pill versus the Spring Hill mine disaster. It might have been the communications company broadside. It was his example that got me involved in the communications company, and I wrote a poem, War is Decor, and helped pass it out, then read it later on Walter Cronkite's national television report on the Haight-Ashbury. This is the communications sheet. War is decor in my cavern cave. The wind whirs outside. I rave within my bone plate tedium. The wall flicks pictures of wounded meat. I don't care, that's neat. I don't care, that's neat. War is decor in my cavern cave, where creature howls on beast within a yeast of bone plate tedium, till Cupid smiles and tears the mass of X's to a cloud of bliss that curls into a molecule to make my birth. I'm born. I'm free. Remember what was happening at that time? Airplanes were flying over constantly. And guess where they were going? They were going to Vietnam. And they never stopped. They just kept going constantly, night and day. So that's my reaction. And I think Richard's reaction is this. I think you should certainly know this poem. All watched over by machines of loving grace. I like to think, and the sooner the better, of a cybernetic meadow where mammals and computers live together in mutually programming harmony like pure water touching clear sky. I like to think, right now please, of cybernetic forest filled with pines and electronics where deer stroll peacefully past computers as if they were flowers with spinning blossoms. I like to think, it has to be, of a cybernetic ecology where we are free of our labors and joined back to nature, return to our navel. I like to think it has to be of a cybernetic ecology where we are free of our labors and joined back to nature, return to our mammal brothers and sisters, and all watched over by machines of loving grace. So, as naive as Richard might seem, he's speaking about environmentalism, he's speaking about ecology, he's speaking about cybernetics, he's speaking about feedback, he's speaking about mutually programming. It's a very sophisticated poem. Richard was crazy about beautiful women. Smoothly glabrous ones with long hair and big eyes. Blonde or brunette didn't matter. He would have been considered real homely in his life, I'm sure, but like a Russian wolfhound puppy, he knew better. When his sex appeal bloomed with his fame, he loved it. He loved all the lovely sex around him, real sensuality, clear and lucid like you read in poetry of the Greek anthology, began to come out in his poetry. But that worm got split about that time, and the secret sexism began to become obnoxious. In rereading Trout Fishing, I began to fear that it would be apolitical and a purely aesthetic document, and there would be no comment against the monster war that was in Vietnam. There was, near the end, I'm pleased to find, Trout Fishing Peace March. I'm sure that poem sent many people out into the streets to protest the war. It was Richard trying to buy the house that David and Tina Meltzer lived in right out from under them and their two children that was the straw that broke my camel's back. I thought he should have bought the house and let them live in it for nothing, or even have given it to them. Property was pretty cheap. Suddenly, Richard was wealthy, and not only real tight, but afraid that people would find out he was wealthy. It was a shock to him, and it was a shock to him, and he had a broad anal streak anyway. It was too much for him to handle. I felt he was not only after me with his success, but also after David, because David was like Richard's anti-type. David poured creativity. It just flowed out of him in vast, spontaneous amounts. I think that Richard had just had to get at David, so he bought him the house and left it standing empty. That was the house he shot himself in. When I reread Trout Fishing in Watermelon Sugar and the early poems, I had a flash of intuition. I was wrong to look at Richard as a novelist. What he is doing seems more akin to Lautréamont and his Chants of Maldoror. Lautréamont was a young South American intellectual named Isidore Ducasse. Ducasse was inspired by Rimbaud and wrote a book-length prose poem, probably one of the most grisly things written. Ducasse then began a chain of thought. Richard should be rightly compared to Rimbaud, to Lautréamont, to Baudelaire, and with the dark school of French writers, the Maudits. His suicide closes his life. Compare him to Alfred Jarry, who also changed personality and became gross and fat and took ether and alcohol. Richard reminds me of the mystic poet Gerard de Nerval also. Further, Richard could be compared to the German visionary Novalis. Novalis was full of aphorisms. His works were studied with him. Richard lacked that in his writing, but as a world of the imagination and of nature melted into the imagination, as is Novalis. The Tigers, Tygers, in Watermelon Sugar, are Shirley Blake's tigers from the tigers of wrath are wiser than the horses of instruction. They have beautiful voices, and the nameless hero asks them for aid in his math problems while they eat his parents. The black world of death, I-death, is the interwound topology of the primal, unformed, and still forming material. Richard lived across the street and down a few yards from the big Sears Roebuck department store on Geary Street. Sears is the forgotten book. Sears is the forgotten works in the novel. By this time, the Sears had been abandoned. It was a huge, massive, empty structure that had been raved about by the newspaper critics of the newspaper critics of sculptures. The black. Anyway, it was abandoned by this time, and the newspapers were so impressed by the structure of that big Sears Roebuck that they wrote glowing reports of it while it was being constructed. In Watermelon Sugar might have been written by an American Lorca. It has the darkness of one of Lorca's late poems. Nobody understands the perfume of the dark magnolia of your womb. On the other hand, in Watermelon Sugar, on the whole, is simple-minded, which Richard was not. What the prose lacks, as does Trout Fishing, is conflict. In both books, Richard almost abolished interpersonal conflict to create a gentle, the word is used over and over, gentle world of the imagination and sensory perception, and memory melted into a pool that Richard took a swimming in, a stream that he fished in. These two books are his great struggle to cancel conflict and confrontation. There's never confrontation because each chapter is in a new place or a new situation. One cannot create a long dramatic work without conflict. Richard can be seen as a phenomenon of the hate and the 60s or as an American artist. I think one might say artist rather than either poet or novelist. I think of myself as an artist. West Coast writers of the period tend to see themselves as artists, not so different from the painters or sandal makers they admire. Artists are free from the specter of the possibility of monetary success or national acclaim, which in these days they knew they would never get. In the 50s, Gary Snyder advised young poets to learn a trade, meaning there was no way to support themselves through their art. Learn to be a merchant seaman or a carpenter. Richard can be seen as a West Coast writer, not that his success was not national or that he was not a national artist. Bill Berkson was, about this time, went back to Yale to teach there, and he asked what people were reading. They all said, in Yale, they all said they were reading Richard Brautigan. The West Coast looks to the mountains and the forests and deserts of Big Sur and Mendocino, and even up here to Puget Sound around it. When strangers visited, I would sometimes take them across the bridge to Mount Tamalpais or to Muir Redwood Forest. San Francisco is part of the United States, but it is also part of the Pacific Basin, and as part of the Pacific Basin, we were connected to the Orient, to Japan, and China. New York looked to Paris and London. San Francisco looked there too. In 1955, Frisco looked like Cowtown, USA. No, but it looked to New York looked to Paris and London. San Francisco looks there too. In 1955, Frisco looked like Cowtown, USA. No tall buildings, no trees. There were Asian people around. They had a different cuisine. Buddhism was something real to them, and lots of them practiced it in a church. Kenneth Rexroth was the ideologue. He showed us that we could define our own personal anarchism, that we were free to invent our own mysticisms or follow old ones. Agnosia, by way of Dionysius the Areopagite, or Kundalini Yoga via Arthur Avalon, or practice Zen Buddhism. Is this still clear? Okay. Thank you. So everyone was free to create their own mysticism or structural thinking through Dionysius the Areopagite, or Kundalini Yoga via Arthur Avalon, or practice Zen Buddhism. Everyone was free to invent or reinvent their own intellective structures of understanding time and space, music and painting. The West Coast was full of deep readers who were also involved in soul building by means of travel and mountain and forest experience. We were different. Kenneth Rexroth did something else too. He showed that we could look to the Orient for poetry and cuisine, but also that we could look back in time. We could look to 1000 AD to Sung Dynasty China, or back to Buddha and Confucius and Lao Tzu in Zhou Dynasty China. Most of us did some Oriental and time traveling by way of art and poetry. Donald M. Allen discovered Richard. He put his faith in Richard, publishing Trout Fishing, then in Watermelon Sugar, and The Pill versus the Spring Hill Mine Disaster. It was Don Allen who brought together the San Francisco issue of Evergreen Review in 1957, linking up Ginsberg, Kerouac, Robert Duncan, Spicer, Broughton, William Everson, Philip Lamontia, and me for the literary public eye. And it was Don who edited the major and poetry world shaker, New American Poetry. In 1960, Richard was not in that anthology as he had not made any impact as yet. Don was his first business world literary gentleman to recognize Olson, Duncan, me, and many others. Regarding information on Richard and the Orient, Shig Murao, who was a man busted for selling Howl at City Lights in 1957, tells me that I should contact Albert Saijo about Richard because it was Albert Saijo who got Richard the job testing meat samples that he had in the early 60s. I'm told incorrectly that a Japanese restaurateur loaned Richard his final gun. Richard had a Japanese wife. Richard had, if I understand correctly, he also had a huge vogue in Japan as he had here. I asked Shig Murao if Richard was not part of the Jack Spicer, Gino, and Carlos bar crowd. Shig said that Richard came here when he was 17 or 18 and hung around North Beach in the early days. Shig said Richard liked to hang out at the place, which was mostly a painters and poets bar in the mid and late 50s. Shig said Richard liked to recite a poem about pissing in the men's room sink. I'd never heard that. Japanese DeFeo, Jay DeFeo, had a show of painting in the place, and Allen Ginsberg had a show of his poems hung with the flower paintings of Robert Levine there. The place was the corner bar for me in 1954. The Du Magot of Francisco. It put the X in San Francisco, existentialism. The place was where I could get high on the beauty of Jay DeFeo's gouaches hung on the walls. Poems of Richard's in the Pill intrigue me a lot. Often the word surrealism is used inaccurately. Horse Child Breakfast might be called a surreal poem by someone, though actually it is quite lucid. Some young woman looks like a horse to Richard, probably because she has long palomino mane and sleek legs. Also, she looks like a child to Richard. I imagine she looks like a horse child to him, also a filly. She is there the whole night, and they have breakfast together, which she probably fixes. It is hard to imagine Richard fixing breakfast. She becomes horse child breakfast, and Richard addresses her as such. This is not surrealism. Actually, it is a love poem owing more to Richard's imagination of Sappho's poems, or even more romantic poems in the Greek anthology, to their lucid, sensual, and sensory address of another person than to a surreal impulse. In fact, the use of the three words, horse, child, and breakfast, probably owes much to Oriental poetry as we understand it. Richard was aware of Ernest Fenollosa's text on the origin of the Japanese ideogram and how elements combine to make a calligraphic character, as well as the concrete use of three words not normally syntactically connected to create a verbal construct. It is quite a delicate poem. It may be naively combining the Greek and the Chinese, but it is canny and it is memorable. It is gorgeous. A big figure in the 50s was philosopher Alan Watts. He was speaking visionary Buddhism and new hypnosis and mystical Taoism on his radio program. The poet Kenneth Rexroth also had a great eccentric book review radio program in which he reviewed the most intellectual and learned terms, everything from Kabbalistic aspects of the Shekinah to the geography of Han Dynasty China to texts on Byzantine Greek theology. There were carpenters there too, and printers and news reporters around who were members or ex-members of anarchist members. There were carpenters and printers and news reporters around who were members or ex-members of anarchist pacifist discussion groups. San Francisco was a rich network of streams to trout about, and Richard must have loved it all as much as I did. Vibrancy of thought was in the air. Consciousness of California landscape and Oriental thought were in the air we breathed and was made dark and moist by the Pacific beating on the coast of Monterey. Steinbeck country was nearby. Henry Miller lived down on Partington Ridge. Robinson Jeffers was in his tower in Carmel. on the beach. Kenneth Patchen was in town. William Carlos Williams came to read for the Poetry Center. Robert Duncan had a class at San Francisco State. A Jack Spicer disciple group met at Joe Dunn's house to read and discuss poetry. Brother Antoninus was in a nearby monastery after his previous career of being poet William Everson. Philip Lamantia was around. He had been acclaimed a major surrealist poet at age 14 by Andre Breton. Kerouac came to town. Creeley visited and ran off with Rex Roth's wife. The buckeye on the mountains was in flower. Everything smelled like redwood and bay. One could see the first appearance of sea otters down the coast. I met Ginsberg at a party for W.H. Auden. I can't remember when I first met Brodigan. An intriguing passage of Richard's in the Pill is Our Beautiful West Coast Things. It begins with an epigraph by Jack Spicer. We are the coast people. There is nothing but ocean behind us. Richard says he is dreaming long thoughts of California on a November day near the ocean. He says this, he is listening to the mamas and papas. Naively, he says in caps, they're great. They're singing a song about breaking someone's heart and digging it. He gets up and dances around the room. San Franciscans were inhabiting their body by learning to dance communal dances with Billy the Kids and Mae West and Florence Nightingales and Beatles Sergeant Majors in the Fillmore Auditorium and in the Avalon Ballroom. Everyone was putting their booties down to the Jefferson Airplane and Big Brother and the Holding Company. The dances were freeform. You could make any beautiful step or wave of arm that you wanted with anyone around you in the floor. Tribal stomp, but it was a lovely stomp, even gentle. As Richard would say, amid the gross amplification and the strobe lights and the large moving patterns of colors on the walls going around and around and around, on all four walls moving around you. It was easy to read free form from chapter to chapter in trout fishing after dancing free form at the Avalon and Fillmore Ballroom. You danced with the partner who was behind you. When you turned around, she had on a dreamy costume and had lovely bare arms. Maybe you had a hit of window box grass, and she was high on acid. She was a goddess. You were some god. Goethe said, experience is only half of experience. The details could shift a lot, but it was all love holy. When Brodigan speaks about dancing in the poem, he is making reference to William Carlos Williams dancing solo in his home, being the happy genius of his household, but the dancing that Richard saw and did at the Fillmore helps to explain the chapter structure of trout fishing. It was what people were doing. Richard was 5 years younger than me. I should tell you that I grew up in Seattle. At least the best years of my life, I grew up in Seattle because I got out of Kansas and got to Seattle. I could see Mount Rainier out our kitchen window. Richard was 5 years younger than me. He was from the Pacific Northwest. I grew up in Seattle. As a kid, the newspaper comic strips that I read were probably the same ones he read. I remember Smokey Stover, where the goofy fire chief with the blank eyes and a big smile tooled around in his three-wheeler car from panel to panel with almost no connection and a host of weird characters. There were little signs on sticks that said Nav Shmaz Kapop or Notary Sojak or even Foo. I also read Tunerville Trolley. There was also just one big panel with dozens of strange, country, and shaggy, shabby, angular whiskerandos and old ladies and terrible children clinging to the country trolley. In Smokey Stover, there was... Has anybody here read Smokey Stover? I'm just talking into the air. It'd make a great book. In Smokey Stover, there was endless play for thought. I've had a request for a poem, and I want to read it. And it's for Paul Nelson.
This poem, The Undertow, is dedicated to Dave Hazelwood, Dave Hazelwood was the producer of Our Hunt books, published more fresh first books by my comrades than anyone else I know of. Undertow for Dave Hazelwood. Imagine the undertow of samsara to be a wave looming over us. We tiny particles of biostuff in the undersurge, chunks of phytoplankton, clam larvae, pharmaceutical molecules, smashed DNA, mother killers, sizeless dimensions of greed, ineffable swirls of psychic density, hormone ribbon drifts, colliding archipelagos of lies, killer mothers, solid nothingnesses, and endless sensory modes of taste and fright, strivings of non-existence for blood power and Godiva fudge creams or a sip of drinkable water. Broken bacteria conjugating, presidential power fantasies, unknown plasmas of miniature hell worlds frighten us out of consciousness to know ourselves only as riffle pits, but a counterforce is the invention of love and building of soul, and not to be protections or armor, but to be real, being real, not love as a dribbling idea we tap into as the disruption rushes in its hyper-metabolic onslaught, but to build love so that we may have brief presence in the ceaseless samsaric undertow and truly touch a wrist or cheek. You're going to get it. I have in my hand a brand new book from Ecstasis Press, and you know who that is. That's Richard Olafson. I'm sorry. A brand new book from Ecstasis Press called Persian Pony. And I'm going to read some poems from it. Here's one for a poem, first a poem for David Meltzer, who departed our universe recently, or at least departed the flat part of our universe. I am the spontaneous poem, Morning After Reading When I Was a Poet, by David Meltzer, for David Meltzer. I am the full-grown old man here with a hat and boots, and you are the ancient child growing shoots of inspiration and genius, each one with multiple buds, sometimes drinking sap from the edge of adventures we had together, climbing the hill, over and up the trolley tracks in the city of wind and fog and nerve-jiggling youth to confront the tucked-in and grumbly gang who disliked the delight you carried in your energy and overflowing fountain. Now we're at the top of Nob Hill Mountain, and it keeps going on, leaving dreams in our sleep, pleasures and tortures and friends left behind, or leaping over the stream, changing shapes around us. Sometimes a shimmer of dust in a pillow's attic. Sometimes a living statue of gold and ivory, as precious as old fresh, and stuffed with the agony of waking to sleep again, taking it slow in the wind-whiskered mirror, reflecting your new love poised in the stream behind you. Leaning into the present future, there's no one like you in the old movies, no Bogart, Chaplin, Lon Chaney, the charnel houses to be of our bop. No beginning and no stop, just the proportionless, fomenting itself in every contour of the moment. We're always there and no present at all, so we turn back from the peak and walk into limbo and Hades. And so we walk into limbo and Hades, and then zut, presto, we pop out in Paradiso, surrounded by cliff tops of choiring angels, painting our faces on nothingness with swooping maneuvers directed by Raphael. Our other recently departed comrade, of course, is Joanne Kiger. Here's a poem for Joanne Kiger, remembering a story of hers that almost got us busted in New Mexico. It's called Joanne Kiger, and it's for her lover, Donald Gurovich. You are the blithe bear bursting through the back wall to nuzzle a hummingbird, while green taro washes toes that know Indian snows and swarms of Mexican siestas with Donald. These matter in samsara like a pink-pinted brooch of fossil ivory when lights go out in the plastic mall and the show closes. Please plant your foot in the gate so I can slip out after you. Also in Persian Pony, Blake Flakes. 1. Stepping down from her soft cubist chrysalis, the princess places her foot on the naked sleeper. 2. In the furnace, the blue-black imp covers his ears, peering down into the poet's face. 3. The plump, naked man-child pisses on the tusked ogress in her cloud of rose petals. Plumed stones. Black and white with red veins, what am I but a plumed stone, an appearance of matter, dreaming antennae and senses, real as time and smoke, a serious joke played on myself by my love of living. I want to read the introduction, the author's preface to Persian Pony. Paul read the introduction. I'm going to read the author's preface. 1,000 Persian ponies fell asleep in the moonlit plaza of your forehead, while through 4 nights I embraced your waist, enemy of snow. Federico Garcia Lorca. Author's preface. Once this was all black plasma and imagination. This book is for the protection of all beings with deep heart's love for Amy, James, Jane, Bill, Michael. A mouse is miracle enough to stagger sextillions of infidels. Walt Whitman. Poems in Persian Pony are written in projective verse, a mode conceived by Charles Olson. Projective verse is neither metrical nor free verse. It gives swift access to the energy of inspiration, moving to the heart, where it bounces to the syllable, to the breath, and onto the field. I'm going to start that over again. This is serious, and it's a little hard to get the idea. Poems in Persian Pony are written in projective verse, a mode conceived by Charles Olson. Projective verse is neither metrical nor free verse. It gives swift access to the energy of inspiration, moving to the heart, where it bounces to the syllable, to the breath, and onto the field of composition. The field of composition may be a paper, or a screen, or a listener's consciousness. It has a commonality with the work of Jackson Pollock and Clifford Still. In these poems, capitals do not need to be spoken loudly. The flow of energy through the system acts to organize the system, said Harold Morowitz. Single letter lines moving down the page move normally as breath does. Poetry is a muscular principle. Poetry must be real as swirls in tar on the street and roses that hang above them. Eagles seen on acid are the horses in clouds. Experiences are nanoscale and vast as the disappearing Anthropocene. These poems wish to be art and nature and free to time dive like orcas in Cascadian waves. Romantic philosopher Friedrich Schlegel wrote, "All art should become science, and all science, art, poetry, and philosophy should be made one." Praise to my gifted friends who brought me these awarenesses, and praise and love to my wife, beloved Amy, always. Still in Persian Pony. The soft new soul, with its capsule of masks, tender and quivering, ascends into matter, and here I am, breathing the old air, the ancient breath of star formation. Everything is past understanding, without inspiration and fearlessness. It's a small white dog on a leash, mindlessly waiting in the wreckage of suicide wars, like the used T-shirts and munitions. The surface of the strata also covers itself in concrete bridges and airports, but we know that at our pulse speeds in the psychosis, learning to be free, and this is freedom and liberation. That is an hour. Thank you, you lovelies. Thank you. Now it is time to feast.